Good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Friday, the day before the weekend. Let's see who's here. So Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. Mark is here. Good morning. Good morning, Mark. Unadi is here. Good morning, Unadi. Shota is here. Good morning, Shota. And Tushinsana is here as well. Good morning. All right. So, yes. So yesterday we were talking about kind of at the end of a Cold War era, right? So we had, after Stalin died in about 1953, he was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev in about 56, right? And Khrushchev was present for kind of a kind of a softening of the Soviet Union, right? He gave his speech, his de-Stalinization and many roads to socialism speech. He was present for, well, he had the Berlin Wall erected. He was part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, with John F. Kennedy. But then in about 1964, we're going to have a bit of a change of, we're going to have a line change, right? Because Nikita Khrushchev will be kind of kicked out of power. The Communist Party will think that he's a bit of a failure. John F. Kennedy will be assassinated. And so we'll have two brand new brand new players on the stage. For the Soviet Union, it's going to be Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev, right? And Brezhnev, we said, comes to power and has a couple of challenges, right? Inside the Soviet Union, he's got social and economic issues, which we'll talk about in a second. He needs to continue to assert control over Eastern Europe, right? Because Khrushchev had kind of softened his approach, Eastern European states are pushing for more independence, right? And he's going to have to deal with that. And of course, he has to improve relationship with the West as well, right? We said that Soviet economic conditions at the time are still struggling, right? Even, years after the Russian Revolution, years after Stalin's 5-year plans and his collectivization of agriculture and his industrialization, the Soviet Union is still lagging behind most of the world, right? Or at least the Western world that they're competing with. And so, because the USSR is kind of underperforming with their economy and because they're injecting so much money into weaponry to sort of match the United States, their citizens have a very poor standard of living, right? So they have lots of food shortages. They're living in kind of small apartments, and they don't really have the kind of luxuries that the Western world has, right? Things like vacuum cleaners and washing machines and cars, things that people started to get in the 1920s and 30s, the Soviets are still kind of struggling to obtain those items, right? So again, this is headed into the 1970s, and most Soviet citizens are living basically in the 1920s, if you will. So it's a pretty kind of unfortunate situation. Again, Soviet citizens are still struggling. Agriculture is underperforming. The Soviet Union is borrowing money, which of course becomes expensive, right? Because you have to pay interest on borrowed money. And so every, $1 billion that they borrow becomes more money that they have to pay out. And they just don't have it, right? Yeah. So ouch. We see in 1968 that Czechoslovakian leader Alexander Dubček wants to make some reforms, right? So he makes some move to de-censor the media, right? So in the Soviet Union, the media says what the Communist Party wants them to say, right? Alexander Dubček says that's over in Czechoslovakia. Say whatever you want, right? The media can report on what they want. He allows the creation of non-communist groups, right? And so human rights watch groups form that might actually evolve into other political parties, right? He grants freedom to travel abroad, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and he he sort of proposes all these things and is going to kind of formalize them on September 9th, right? And again, Brezhnev is frightened, right? Quite frankly, because if all of these freedoms are extended to Czechoslovakia, everyone else will follow, right? Again, what one state in Eastern Europe gets, the other ones will push for as well, right? And so here we see, similar to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the Soviets invade, right? And so all of these proposed reforms get the response of the Red Army, right? And so we read yesterday that about 500,000 troops enter Czechoslovakia, tanks, planes, the whole thing. Dubček is pulled out of power and replaced with someone who is pro-Moscow and very repressive, right? And so, and so that's kind of the end of that, right? And so we can see here, just give me 1 second, I just need to drop a file in here. We can see that, you know, even though the Soviet Union had to provide some freedoms to Poland, and, you know, earlier on, there's still a very strong feeling of maintaining control in Eastern Europe, right? And so things were a little softer under Khrushchev, but Brezhnev is going to reestablish Soviet authority, right? We said yesterday that Poland is facing similar problems to the Soviet Union. Their economy is struggling, their agriculture isn't producing, communism itself is not really, communism isn't a great way to make money, as it turns out. And so the economic conditions in Poland are kind of, you know, held off by the fact that the price for Polish exports on the world market is high, and the Soviet Union is pumping money into Poland, right? But when the price of those goods on the world market goes down, suddenly Poland is running out of money, right? They try to raise prices, but people revolt and start to strike. And so, sorry, I just gotta fix that. So what we see is a lot of striking, right? So workers refusing to work and demanding government change, right? So at first the strikes are simply to correct food prices because the government tried to jack them up and nobody was happy with that. But later this particular strike at Gdansk shipyards, Gdansk is a city in Poland, results in the Polish government recognizing the shipyard workers as a union, right? And so we said that now all the workers are banded together and they negotiate with the government as a single force, right? And this is important because if you have numbers, you have leverage, right? And so we said yesterday that if I'm a factory owner and Yoya comes in to ask for a big raise, it's just much easier for me to fire him, right? And send him out the door, right? Because I don't have to negotiate with him. I can replace him tomorrow, right? But if the workers are unionized and Yoya comes in as a representative of all of the factory workers and say, hey, we need to talk about wages, and if you don't negotiate with us, we're going to walk out of the job tomorrow, then my factory doesn't run. Then I don't make any money, right? So I have to bargain with Yoya, right? I can't just send him out the door. But we said that this is kind of I don't know if it's a mistake or not, but the Polish government grants these shipyard workers the ability to be in a union, but then they extend it to other trades as well, right? So electricians and police officers and rail workers and all kinds of different people can form their own unions, right? So they can negotiate with the Polish government for better wages or better working conditions or whatever they might want. But what happens, unfortunately for the government, is that all of these unions join each other, right? And so they become one mega union, right? They become this solidarity. And that's what solidarity means there. It's this unity or agreement of feeling or action, right? So this solidarity union becomes massive to the point where 40% of workers in Poland, I think it's 40, belongs to solidarity. So now you've got a lot of leverage, right? You've got a lot of power. So when Yoya comes in and talks to me, the Polish government, and not only does he doesn't just represent himself, and he doesn't just represent the shipyard workers, he represents 40% of the workers in Poland. Now I've really got to negotiate with Yoya, right? Because I can't have 40% of people not showing up to work tomorrow, right? The entire country will shut down, right? There'll be no police, no fire, no people driving the buses, nobody in the hospitals, nothing, right? I have to negotiate with this guy. And so Solidarity winds up having a lot of power, and they start to use that power to try to push the Polish government to do certain things, right? To make certain changes. Well, we'll see that as we come into the early 80s, there'll be a switch in Polish leadership. So Gomulka, who we met earlier, will be out. Jaruzelski will be in. And Jaruzelski has no patience for these Solidarity guys, right? They have too much power and he doesn't want to deal with them. So what does he do? He shuts down the country. He rounds up the Solidarity leaders and throws them all in jail and makes Solidarity illegal. Right? So he basically dissolves the union, arrests the leaders, and tries to go back to normal, right? But again, Solidarity will return, okay? So I have a little more video to show you. For online people, the video is, hang on. Did it go in there? No, it didn't go in there. For online people, shoot. For online people, the video is in Microsoft Teams. It's just loading, so it might take a few seconds to upload. Hopefully only a few seconds. But what we're going to do is we're just going to watch a little more of the film to get us caught up. Then we will we'll have a little more to do, and then I think next week we can start on China. So I think I'd like to just press pause on this Soviet story for a little while and sort of address the story of China as well, okay? So, but we'll watch the film. So online people, if you look for it in Microsoft Teams, you'll see it's under Class 39, the Cold War. So look for it under Files. We'll watch it, and then we'll come back here and discuss what we've seen, okay? So online people, I'll turn you loose to do that. We'll see you in just a little bit. Oops, nope. Okay, and we're back. So, we watched a section of this video. Again, we kind of watched part of this yesterday, but we ran out of time, unfortunately, so we walked through it again. And you can see a couple of important things happening, right? We have some strategic arms limitation talks, right? So these are SALT treaties that are designed to keep this nuclear arms race that the US and the USSR are engaged in, to kind of hopefully put some limits on it, right? Although by now, each side has tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. It's well out of hand, but still, you know, the idea that they would limit those arms is probably a good thing, right? They signed some documents in Helsinki, Finland, right, that sort of formalize the borders of Eastern Europe, as we'll read about shortly, but also agree that, or forces both sides to agree that human rights are an important thing, right? And Gerald Ford is kind of like, oh good, it's a time bomb for the Soviets, right? And so we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Yeah, and then we saw a little bit from Hungary with Alexander Dubček and a little bit with Poland, right? So we're kind of caught up, I think, in that regard. So I have some pages for you to read here that describe some of the things we've heard about. I would like you to read them and answer the questions, and then I would like to talk about them in 12 minutes. So I'm going to put 12 minutes on the clock, and then we will do that, okay? So I'll turn you loose to read that, and then we will discuss. And I will just make sure that those pages are in Microsoft Teams. And indeed they are, okay? Yes. Say again? I uploaded it. I'm not sure when, but it's there. Nope. No, I think it was. Let me see. Yesterday at 9:57 a.m. Okay, you see it? Okay. What's that?
It's crazy.
What's crazy?
There's nothing.
Like, like what?
Like the Soviet boycott
The whole thing's crazy.
Yeah.
It was a.
Like I can't imagine it happening now because now I feel like the world is getting soft. People get used to it.
It,
Very people get used to it.
it feels a little. It feels a little boring in comparison, doesn't it?
So many things are happening, but hey.
Okay, can we talk about some of these? Yes? No? No, we can't?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can? Okay. So, we haven't really talked about this yet because I know we've kind of ignored the story of China, but we just kind of bump into it a little bit with the Soviet Union. Number 9. So the Soviet Union and China are going to be kind of close buddies, right? When Mao proclaims People's Republic of China in 1949, I think. It's another communist state, right? And so the Soviet Union is only too happy to make friends with China and provide them with investment and technological help and all kinds of things. But here, kind of when we get to the 1970s, we see that relationship is kind of growing apart. And why are the Soviets and China kind of having relationship troubles?
It's about like the Soviet Union want to do some military things in China, like the runways, and China government, the Chinese government think this is kind of hurt for the Chinese sovereignty.
Okay, yeah, and probably that's part of a bigger issue too, is the idea that, China and Mao in China wants to, he wants kind of more sovereignty on of his own, right? He wants to be able to, make policy decisions and sort of chart the course of communism, right? He wants to be seen as a leader of the communist world, just like Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, right? But the USSR isn't really ready to recognize him as that, right? They feel he's kind of like a second-rate communist, right? So they don't have a lot of respect for him, but also, the Soviet Union isn't willing to give up any control really that they don't have to, right? Um, they're trying to maintain their control of Eastern Europe, and again, they're not really interested in, giving Mao a seat at the table, right? And so he's kind of upset about that. What else is kind of affecting their relationship?
It's like another reason is because of the new leader of the Soviet Union. He is saying that like Stalin is his best. He is totally disagree about like Stalin's idea. Like the Chinese government don't agree about this. Like they think Stalin is still have something to do with the
Okay, so they have they have kind of different opinions on Stalin, or how?
on
No,
Stalin.
and the new guys.
Oh, okay.
What's the guy's name?
Who, Brezhnev?
Yeah. And actually, at that time, Chinese government they are kind of support Stalin, and we kind of agree that opinion. Actually, yes, at that time they understanding why the new guys say some bad things about Stalin because just like every new president will say, just like America, every
Yeah.
new president will say some bad thing about the new guys, but it's too much, and I think it also have a reason that's like at that time China is kind of like become more stronger, and we don't want just like for all over the Soviet Union. I think the how to say
Yeah.
So this far along.
Yeah, right. Mao has been a leader of the communist world for 20 years now, right? And he wants, you know, China wants to be respected as that, but they also want, you know, the ability to make their own policy decisions, right? But of course, the Soviet Union still feels like they're the leader of the communist world, and they're not willing to accept China as that, right? They're not willing to acknowledge China as that. There's something about technology too, about nuclear technology, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, like the Soviet Union promises that like they will share some of the nuclear technology of the atomic bomb or like something else technology. They will share the information about the part of like in China and like they will develop them like together. But like when the new president when this was like Stalin's promise, but like the new president of the Soviet Union didn't agree about this.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of, you know, in the early days of the People's Republic, there's a lot of stuff that comes from Soviet Union, right? A lot of investment in technology that they, you know, assist Mao and China with, right? But at this point in history, you know, Mao is also asking for assistance with nuclear technology, right? And the Soviet Union is unwilling to help, right? They've signed non-proliferation treaties. Maybe they're a little bit worried about his loyalty or whatever it is, but either way, they say no, right? They decline to help him with that, and so he's not happy about that as well, right? And so, you know, as that relationship grows apart between Soviet Union and China, we see that the U.S. reestablishes their connection with China because they were, well, we haven't even actually talked about this. We'll leave it for now. But why does the United States reconnect with China?
Because they are having the open border with the Soviet Union, and like China is becoming like stronger and stronger. Because like in the past maybe past 20 years, China is very weak and like nobody cared what the Chinese mandate is. And like America also don't care like what China is. But like after China is becoming stronger, and like the China can have some how can I say China have some menace to the Soviet Union now, and like when the China's relationship with the Soviet Union become bad, and like the America, so like they will help China for against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's true, right? Yeah. So this is a period where, you know, China is kind of growing in power and industrial capacity and in population. And, you know, before it's kind of, for the Americans anyway, it's a big scary block, right? You've got communist China and you've got Soviet Union. They're right beside each other, and it's this big block of communists, right? And it's kind of scary for the US. But now it seems like China's kind of drifting away from the Soviet Union, right? And the Americans are only too happy to kind of put their arm around China and say, "Oh, come here and hang out with us," right? Come.
Just like they don't want China to support the Soviet Union anymore, and at that time we also need a powerful country can help us in as some technology like this kind of weapon.
Yeah.
And at that time the two most powerful countries were the Soviet Union, like America. And now the relationship between we and Soviet Union is become more and more worse. So we also have like
Yeah, at the time, yeah, it's kind of, and it's almost a little bit of, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
yeah,
If they're not,
enemies and enemies.
yeah, if China is opposed to the Soviet Union, then let's bring them over to our side, right? So you see the Americans kind of trying to establish a connection with China, right? Recognizing them. We saw in the video Richard Nixon went to China, right? And they had a big, you know, they had lots of meetings and cultural exchanges, and they had a great time, right? Um, let's see. Oh yeah. So we read about those Helsinki agreements, right? And we saw them being signed in the video. There was kind of one important thing for the U.S. that the U.S. got out of those documents, and there was one important thing that the Soviet Union got out of those documents. So what did the Soviet Union get that they wanted? What did the Soviet Union get out of those Helsinki agreements that they wanted?
It makes the lands that the Soviet Union made was Germany and Poland in the
Yeah, so all of the borders of Eastern Europe, where those countries have their borders, those weren't finalized at the end of World War II, right? The two sides were kind of fighting at the end of World War II, and they didn't agree to the borders of Eastern Europe. And so the Soviet Union always wanted the West to say, yes, we agree to these borders, right? And so finally in Helsinki in 1975, the US signs on and says, yes, we agree to the borders in Eastern Europe as they are, right? So the Soviet Union's wanted that for a long time, and that's a win for them, right? They get it. What does the US get that they want? So the Soviets get their borders approved, which they wanted. What do the Americans want?
these agreements is the help of the Americans to separate the democracy
It's helpful for them to separate the democracies. What?
yeah.
Okay. I'm a little confused. Can you explain that a bit for me?
These agreements is help is can support America like to tell the people in the other countries that the democracy is happening.
Oh, maybe. I don't know if that. Maybe that's kind of a side effect of these things, but hey, maybe it's a side effect of these things. But I'm thinking more about the human rights, part, right? So both the Soviet Union and the U.S. and a bunch of other countries too sign on, and they say that basically they say that human rights are important, right? People have human rights, they have fundamental freedoms, and those freedoms should be respected, right, and upheld. And of course, the Soviet Union at the time, the advisor to Brezhnev says, "Don't worry, Leonid, it's just a piece of paper," right? But Gerald Ford says it's a time bomb, right? He says that, now the Soviet Union has agreed on paper that human rights are important, right? And so Gerald Ford correctly predicts that once the Soviet Union agrees that human rights are important, people are going to start to push them and say, hey, respect our human rights, Soviet Union, right? You said you would, now do it, right? And so the Soviet advisor is saying, don't worry, it's just a piece of paper, but it's symbolic, right? It means that the Soviet Union has acknowledged it. And so it's going to, for the Soviets anyway, it's going to cause them problems because people are going to start pushing for human rights, right? They're going to start to demand that the Soviet Union offer them freedoms that most of the rest of the world has, right? So these Helsinki agreements are, they're not binding, right? They're not, they're not a huge deal, but in some ways they are, right? The Soviet Union gets something out of it, the Americans get something out of it, and for the nations of Eastern Europe, it's proof that the Soviet Union knows what human rights are, right? So they know what human rights are, they're just not respecting them. And so people are going to push the Soviets to to honor those, right? We read about the Soviets invading Afghanistan, and I'll admit this is a complicated story, right? You read about it, and there's all these different, there's different factions, and there's a king, and the king gets kicked out by his cousin, and the cousin takes control and establishes a dictatorship, but then another faction rises up and kicks him out of power, and then there's all these mujahideens who are fighting, and it's a big complicated mess, right? And so it's probably a little too much detail for us to keep track of unless unless you're familiar with Afghani politics, but I'm not. It's a little difficult to keep track, but why does the Soviet Union invade? What's their purpose?
They want to the communist government in that place, in the Afghans, and is being attacked. So they want to rebuild or to protect their communities. So they do that.
Yeah, they had before the king was overthrown. Those two countries were kind of friendly, right? So the Soviet Union had kind of an ally in Afghanistan, right? And then the king got kicked out. There's all this political turmoil. The Soviets are worried that they will lose a communist ally, and so in they go to try to support the Marxist government that's in place, right? How does it go for them? How's that war in Afghanistan go for the Soviets? How's it? Actually, does it say how it goes? It's hard to say? Maybe at this point it's hard to say. Well, I don't know. They asked the question, what were the results? What were the results of the war in Afghanistan? Say that one more time. Yeah, they kind of encounter a lot of problems, right? Because they get in there and they take Kabul, right, the capital city. That's pretty easy. But the problem is that Afghanistan is quite mountainous, right? It's quite rocky, and they don't really have any central leadership, right? So all of these kind of local warlords, right, these little mujahideens or whatever they're called, they're not coordinated. And so when you take the capital city, normally that means you take over command of the army and the government, and you've won, right? You're in charge. But here, all those mujahideens aren't listening to the central government. So you've got to defeat all of them because they're all doing whatever they want, right? So the Soviet Union is trying to fight, hundreds of different opponents. They're all in the mountains and, hiding in caves and things like that. And the Soviets aren't really used to fighting like this, and they struggle to win. And what will happen eventually is that they won't be able to win. And so they'll roll into Afghanistan here in 1979. But sadly, they will be kind of too embarrassed to leave because they don't want to be seen as having lost the war, right? And it's the same thing with the Americans in Vietnam, right? The Americans are in Vietnam trying to fight against Ho Chi Minh's communists, and they don't want to admit that they are losing either, right? But eventually, the Americans are forced to give up and say, we can't win this war, we're out, right? Of course, millions of people will die before that, but same thing happens for the Soviets here. It's a war they can't win, but for a long while, they're too embarrassed to give up and leave. And finally, when they do, it's 1989. So they're there for 10 years fighting this war, trying to prop up this communist government in Afghanistan. And again, pouring massive amounts of resources into it. Let me just see, where's my, I got a slide here that I want to show you. Oh yeah. 25. So, yeah, so they're there for 10 years. They only lose about 15,000 Soviet soldiers. I don't have numbers for how many Afghanis die, but I'm sure it's more than 15,000. It costs them $12 million a day to conduct this war. $12 million a day. And again, if you multiply it out by the 10 years they were there, is that $43 trillion? Is that what it is? I'm not used to looking at numbers that big, except maybe in my bank account balance. No.
I think it's more.
You think it's more than 43 trillion?
Yeah, because if you do 12 million and 365 days for 10 years,
Yeah.
that's
That's a big number, right? So, and again, think about how stupid this is, because the Soviet Union's economy is underperforming. They're spending a bunch of money to feed their people and to build up, the same amount of arms as the United States, and they're dumping all this money into Afghanistan for no good purpose. And ridiculous, right? Yeah, it's hard to count the spaces, right? Well, isn't this would be 1 million, right? And wouldn't this be 1 billion? If it would that be 800 billion? So is that 43 trillion? I don't know. That's a lot of money, right? And again, what is the point of all of this, right? But you have to wonder if they pumped this much money into, like, what if they did the Marshall Plan in Afghanistan? What if they just pumped a bunch of money into the government? They probably would have been able to do a lot more good than destroying the country for whatever purpose. But anyway, stupid thing, but here they are, right? Stuck in Afghanistan, fighting a war they can't win, spending $12 million a day for the next 10 years, right? Ridiculous. Okie dokie. So that kind of brings us up to, in the video they mentioned that kind of a change in the tide, right? So again, we're going to get some new leaders coming to the forefront. So Brezhnev is going to die. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze here in a minute. Brezhnev is going to die in, I think, about 1980 or 81. He's going to be succeeded by a guy named Yuri Andropov. We heard about him because he was head of the KGB. Yuri Andropov is going to be secretary of the Communist Party for about a year, and then he's going to die. Sorry, spoiler alert. He's going to die. He's going to be succeeded by another guy, Konstantin Chernenko. Chernenko is going to last about a year, and then he's going to die too. Has quite a drinking problem, Chernenko does. So after that happens, the Soviet Union and the Communist Party are basically embarrassed. They're like, it doesn't look good if our leaders keep dying every year, right? We need to project a strong image. And so they're going to look for someone who will not die in a year, someone who's a little bit younger, and they're going to find Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And Gorbachev will kind of be present for the last phase of the Soviet Union, but we'll get to that later. Same thing with the Americans. We saw Gerald Ford, we saw Jimmy Carter. Eventually we're going to get to Ronald Reagan, right? And Ronald Reagan, shockingly, was an actor in Hollywood in the 1960s. He did westerns and things like that. But he's going to become president of the United States in, early 80s. And so the last phase of the Cold War is going to be kind of mapped out by these two guys, by Ronald Reagan, American president, and by Mikhail Gorbachev, the secretary of the Communist Party in USSR. But we're going to put a pause on that story and come back to it. because next week we'll start dealing with story of China, okay? Because we've neglected China for far too long here. We've ignored them entirely in the course of this 20th century history, and so we're going to step back a little bit and see how communist China is born and kind of what that history is like for the second half of the 20th century, okay? So before we go, I'm going to hand back quizzes from last time, and then we'll just review very quickly, okay? So let me just make sure. So online people, just bear with me for 1 second here. Yep, that's it. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Daniel, Miles, Michelle, Sydney, Yo, I've got this for you from last time. And Jim, I've got this for you from last time. Rizzo, I've got this for you here. Michelle. Daniel, I've got this for you. Shota. Andre, I've got this for you. There you go. Dan, Sophie. Miles, I got this for you here. That's yours too. Miles, this is yours too. Premio, this is you. Jim, this is you. Jesse, okay. So, all right. So, let's review this quiz 3 quickly here, and then we'll be able to go, okay? So, Hitler's New Order, there's 3 kind of, where are we here? There were some main features of his grand vision for Germany. What was part of his plan, part of his New Order? Give me one thing. There's probably about 5 things, 4 or 5 things.
Germany hegemony.
What's that?
Germany hegemony.
Germany.
H-E-G-E-M-O.
Oh, yes, hegemony. Yeah. So part of his new order is the idea of German hegemony, right? So Germany will be kind of the power center of Europe and will have control over all of Europe, right? That's part of his vision. What else is he thinking about? Yeah, economic self-sufficiency, right? So he wanted Germany to be economically independent. He used the word autarky, or the text used the term autarky, if you will, right? Okay, so German hegemony, autarky, what else? I think he was going to rationalize industry and agriculture, right? He was going to kind of organize sort of agricultural production and industrial production on a continent-wide basis, right? With Germany at the center, right? All the raw materials going into the center, and then Germans manufacturing them and selling them back out, right? So he was going to rationalize work and industry that way. He had plans for the people of Europe too, right? What were different people? What was his plan there? Different kinds of people. Let me see. I think what he said is that basically pure-blood Germans were going to be in power, right? They were going to be full citizens, people who were, you know, who looked like Germans, right? British or people from Nordic countries. They might be able to work and help out in Germany, but they wouldn't be citizens. And then other people like Slavic people, Roma or Gypsies, Jewish people, they were going to be kind of kicked out, right? There wasn't really going to be a place for them within Hitler's new order, right? So there was kind of a social part of his plan. There was an economic part of his plan. I guess there was a political one too, right? German hegemony. So Germans would be in control of Europe, right? They'd be at the top. I'm not sure if I missed anything, but I think that kind of covers it. Number two, why did they call this first part of World War II the phony war? There was this kind of what?
Like, we're hesitating because
Yeah,
we're
no.
not really active.
Yeah, nobody kind of did anything. Nobody was really fighting yet, right? So the Britain and France and Canada and others, they declared war on Germany, but they kind of weren't ready to fight, right? And so they were kind of getting ready. They were, threatening Germany, and Germany was threatening the Allies, but nobody was really fighting quite yet, right? And so phony is kind of a slang term for something that's fake, right, or not genuine. Again, we don't really use that term anymore, but now that people have called it the phony war, we're stuck with it, right? We said the Germans rolled into France pretty quickly in 1940, and Paris surrendered in about 6 minutes, right, which is embarrassing. But how was France kind of divided up, and who was in control of the different parts?
Most of it was German. Germany was in the north, west of France, because they were trying to fight the United Kingdom.
Yeah, so kind of the north of France and along the Atlantic Ocean, the Germans were in control of that, right? Because that was where eventually the British would land, right? They'd invade from there. So the Nazis were kind of controlling the northern part of France. And who was in charge of the south part of France?
I'm not sure. I think it was them.
Who's them?
France.
Yeah. So the French government continued to be in charge of the southern part of France, but they were kind of taking their orders from the Germans anyway, right? So they were kind of in charge, but also kind of not, right? So so Germany is in charge of the northern half and along the Atlantic Ocean. The French government is still in charge of the southern part of France. We listened to the Never, Never, Never speech by Winston Churchill. Who was the audience for that speech? Who was he speaking to? Yeah, he was speaking to students at a school, at Harrowsmith School or whatever it was called. He was speaking to them. Who else might have he been speaking to, though?
The United Kingdom people.
Yeah, right. The people of the country, right? I'm sure that we listened to a recording, right? So they put a microphone in front of Winston Churchill, and I imagine that people all across the country heard what he had to say. And what was he trying to communicate to them? What was he trying to tell them?
Like, reassure them that, like, they shouldn't be afraid. They're strong enough to do this, and they shouldn't be scared. They have to confront them, try to confront them.
He's trying to comfort them and reassure them that indeed they, you know, they shouldn't be afraid, that their things are better and that they can win this thing, right? Yeah. What else, if anything? He's definitely trying to comfort them.
Yeah, and in some way to also strengthen the people. I think because he was talking to young boys, but like around teenagers, yeah, maybe it was also some way of like encouraging them to join the army.
Oh, maybe, right? Maybe, you know, the kids he's talking to are probably a little bit young for that, but yeah, he's, you know, maybe he's encouraging people that, you know, to step up and do your duty, right? We can do this. We just have to be strong, right? We have to be tough. We have to be persistent, right? But yeah, I think that's maybe possible. It's maybe possible. Anything else he was trying to communicate to people? Strength, perseverance, comfort. You know, don't
Never
be
give up.
what?
Never give up.
Yeah, never give up, right? Because who's not giving up?
Shouldn't give up on their country.
Yeah, the country's not giving up, right? They're going to continue with this war until they win, right? Never give in, never, right? Okay, and the last one, the last of the 8 stages of genocide. What is it?
Denial.
Denial. And what happens during that phase?
Pretty much say denial. Like they make up excuses why they did it, was worth it or not.
Yeah.
And they lose against those arguments. They start saying, "Oh no,
Yeah, they try to convince people it didn't happen, right? There's lies, there's explanations, there's cover-ups, there's destroying the evidence, all these things, right? To try to convince people that no, it didn't happen, right? It's a civil war, or it's fake news, or we don't know what you're talking about. Any of those things, right? So denial is usually the last stage. Okay, that is all I have for you. You can pack it up, have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday, okay?